Bienvenidos, bienvenidas, bienvenides. Welcome back to our returning listeners, and hello to all our new audience members. If you've been listening for a while, you might know that we usually release student work between semesters. These episodes usually consist of different students sharing their final projects and cover a wide array of topics. This time, however, we're bringing you something a little different. Each Wednesday in January, we will be releasing a podcast episode fully created by the students in my Fall 2024 Survey of Caribbean Literature course. These students worked together in groups throughout the semester to create podcast episodes that reflected the literature, themes, and concepts we covered in the class. They researched the ideas that interested them the most and analyzed different forms of literature from the Caribbean, including novels, short stories, poetry, songs, and film. They learned how to record, edit, and produce a podcast project that they could be proud of putting out into the world. Please let them know how you feel about their work by listening and sharing this episode. Give them a shout out on social media by tagging Latinx Visions on Instagram and Blue Sky. I know I'm proud of the work they did, and they should be too. So without any further delay, here's this week's episode.
Welcome everyone to our podcast. My name is Daniela Z, and in this segment, we will be diving into the nuances of certain Caribbean-centered media. We'll be hearing from Imani, Daniela, Yael, Mercy, and Julia about their opinions and analysis on the movie Sanky, Panky, as well as some literary works that have connecting themes. For a bit of background, Sanky Panky is a Dominican comedy movie about three friends who are charming womanizers using lies to seduce women. Their carefree nature leads to complications when they meet a group of women who aren't easily fooled. The film combines humor with a message about relationships and personal growth. Our groups will be, along with other themes, mainly focused on toxic masculinity. For those who don't know, toxic masculinity is a term that describes the negative aspects of exaggerated masculine traits that can be harmful to men, boys, and society in general. Now, I'm going to turn it over to our first group to get us started on their thoughts and analysis.
Hi everyone, my name is Yael and I'm here with
Daniela
and Imani.
And today we're going to be talking about the movie Sanky Panky.
We're going to relate the movie to common themes that we talked about and learned about in our class.
So to start us off, what did you guys like or didn't like about the movie? I'll go first. One thing that I really liked was the soundtrack. It offered a wide variety of good music, I think from like dembow to bachata and even some English songs. You know, one of the things that was written about the movie was that it seemed more like a soundtrack than a movie. Another thing that I really enjoyed was just how funny the movie is. But yeah, those were what I really liked about the movie.
Yeah, I personally thought the movie was hilarious. I liked that his friends were very partying and always sneaking around. I didn't get to hear the music because the video that I watched it on, I think they were trying to avoid getting copyrighted. But I did search up like what songs were there, and I agree, like there was a big variety of music. I like how hearing everyone's humor that everyone had, like I'm Puerto Rican, but a lot of the Dominican slang and like Dominican jokes are very similar. So it was just me laughing throughout the entire movie.
I like the fact that it was a comedic take on real life social issues. So, for example, how basically made up of the social mobility. And I feel like that's portrayed throughout the movie, but in a funny way that you can obviously tell like it's very satirical. And how my colleagues were saying it's a very funny movie, but I feel like it also gives you that sense of, wait, we're talking about something real here.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So we all said that it was pretty funny. Do you guys have a scene in particular that you find funny? I know for me, it was when Genaro is confronted by Martha's ex-fiance at the resort. and Martha's ex is an American and he doesn't speak Spanish, and Genaro is a Dominican and doesn't speak English. So there was a scene where they're arguing over Martha, and the guy basically says, "You want a piece of me?" And Genaro understands, why are you talking about pizza? Like, what? And I just thought, it's funnier in Spanish, but it's pretty funny.
Yeah, the part that I found hilarious was when Genaro was trying to kiss her at the beach, and the bands, like the mariachi bands or whatever, they kept coming in to sing, and he kept yelling at them, and Marta had no idea what he was saying. Then he had no idea what she was saying because she was crying about her ex. And although I have experienced situations where language barriers are very stressful, I thought in this situation it was like the funniest thing ever, because they were just yelling at each other, and then he thought she was crying because of the music or because he tried to kiss her, but in reality she was crying because of her ex, and he had no idea. So
This is gonna sound very weird when I say it out loud, but in different parts of the movie where the men are just looking at the women, like just objectifying them, it cracks me up, because me growing up in the Dominican Republic, when I would go visit, we would always see the men and how they look at women like they're just like pieces of meat. And it's very funny when you see that, because the whole movie, it just makes fun of things that happen in real life. So when you see that happening...
Yeah, I agree. It's very funny because even though it's like a weird thing and we don't like it, obviously, but I'm not going to lie, like the way they were talking about it was funny. Like his friend was talking about, like they just keep saying the word gringa like every single 5 minutes, and they're just like, they hate their own kind, and it's a little funny the way they say it. Yeah,
I think the term is like snow bunny, that's what they were looking for.
Yeah.
Just for like them to move up in wealth. So they would just always like just look like they're looking, and it's horrible, but it's pretty funny because it's dragged out throughout the movie.
So on that point, do you sympathize with Renato? Because, you know, he is a Sanky Panky. He is trying to con these women into, you know, flying him out of the country. Like, do you sympathize with Renato?
I do, because I feel like it's more like you gotta do what you gotta do type of situation. And me personally, like I've seen my dad like move up in the little hierarchy that where Dominicans are trying to surpass their lifestyle that they have right now. Not saying that my dad was a Sanky Panky, but he was trying to like elevate his regular lifestyle. So I feel like I'm a little biased. So I kind of feel for Genaro.
Do like sympathize with him, because like in the opening of the movie you do see like the sense of poverty, like he's walking through the market and it looks like a mess, but I think the way that he went about it, like to solve his money problems, is, you know, not the best. You know, it's not great.
I definitely sympathize with him. I feel like it's clear the reason he feels the need to learn English, the need to marry a white woman, is due to society. Like, obviously, he's trying to get out of his situation, but at the same time, I feel like he lacks the appreciation for his own culture and his own country, and he's obsessed with women who look nothing like his mother, nothing like if he had any sisters. And I think it's not necessarily his fault. I think deep down, he just wanted to be happy. Like, he was just seeking happiness in the wrong places, though. I think he could have been a little bit more grateful for what he had and his culture, like I said. But I understand, and it's not an uncommon thing.
So do you think he got what he had coming to him?
I think he ended up getting something so much better than what he was seeking. He was just focused on the wrong things, like I said. But I think everything worked out for him, and I think it was a learning experience for him. And I can't imagine how many men and women, too, in real life had those exact, like, epiphanies about, like, oh, I don't really need this.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Like, you know, he doesn't get to marry a foreign lady, but he does meet the love of his life. And, you know, I think worked out well for him. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. It was bittersweet.
Yeah.
One thing to mention, though, is that his friends do leave the country. So, like, which is really funny. Like, his friends get what he wanted, but he found the love of his life. So now let's segue into the topic of immigration from the Dominican Republic. So Genato's main goal is to get to America. And the way that he does this is basically he wants to con a white lady to marry him so he could get a visa and travel to the United States. And he's doing this because he wants to acquire wealth. He wants to get richer. And so for him, going to the U.S. would be like a magic key that would solve all his financial struggles. Now, Genaro is not unique in his wanting to go to the U.S. Many Dominicans hold the belief that if you get to leave and come to the U.S., you will be financially well off. And we actually see this idea in His Early Skirt as well. In His Early Skirt, the two main protagonists, Michaela and Miriam, both want to travel to New York. They say things like, the streets are made of gold. And there was also an example in the book where Miriam talks about how if she lived in the U.S., she would eat so much, even eat 6 times if she felt like it. So basically, there is this idea within Dominican culture that you do want to escape, you do want to go to the U.S., and if you can make it there, you will be fine. Maybe not necessarily Bill Gates, but you will be financially well off. Actually, while I was looking back at it, did you guys catch that in Zuli Skirt, they actually mentioned Sanky Pankys? It's in the scene where Miriam is braiding a foreign lady's hair, and she says Sanky came over to talk to the foreign lady as she's braiding her hair. Yeah, and I thought that was really cool that in the book, they actually mention it. They don't say Sanky Panky, they just say Sanky.
What are the odds?
Yeah.
I actually didn't realize that. I think I didn't really know what Sanky Panky was until this month. Like, I didn't know I wasn't familiar with the term, but it's crazy that it's just like so common. You know, that's why I was saying, like, I don't think Gerano's a bad person. It's just the way it is.
You're not the only one. Professor herself realized that when we were having our meeting.
That's so interesting.
But it's not just that there is this idea within Dominican culture. It's also backed up by the numbers. So currently there are 1.3 million Dominican immigrants living in the U.S. and 2.7 million inhabitants identifying within the Dominican diaspora, according to the Migration Policy Institute. So there's a very large number of Dominicans in the U.S. In fact, we're the 5th largest Latino group in the U.S., according to the 2010 Census Bureau. Seeing as this idea is so prevalent amongst Dominicans and so many Dominicans have actually carried this out, one must actually pose the question, what is it actually like to immigrate to the U.S.? And what is it like to actually live in the U.S. as a Dominican? Are the streets of New York really paved in gold? Unfortunately, the streets of the U.S. are not made of gold. Speaking from my own family's experience, initially when you come to the U.S., it can be very hard and very taxing. The stories that my parents tell me, they would often tell me how when they first came, they didn't know the language. So it was really hard to communicate. And not knowing the language can really snowball. Not knowing the language affects the jobs that you can get. So the jobs that my parents had in DR were not the same as they were here. Like, they were less professional. They were more work with your hands sort of jobs as opposed to the jobs that they had in DR. And they also had to work multiple jobs, weekdays and weekends, just to make ends meet. And so when my parents came over, they also came over with my older brother. And for him, he told me that it was a very lonely experience. Like, he didn't know the language either. So that first summer before he went to school, he told me like that was the loneliest part of his childhood. And it was just because like he couldn't communicate with anybody. Yeah. So do you guys have like a similar experience? And Imani, I know you're from Puerto Rico, but you know.
I mean, I was born here and so were my parents, but all 4 of my grandparents were born on the island. And even though Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory, it's still a culture shock to come here from the island because, again, like my grandparents, they weren't fluent in English. And I know a lot of my friends and family whose parents or grandparents, like let's say they had a degree in Puerto Rico or more so like Dominican Republic, it doesn't it's not valid in the States. And so I know that in so many aspects, like you were talking about the job aspect of it, it's just a really stressful thing. But my grandparents did come here to live a better life because the jobs in Puerto Rico were so limited. And there was just a lot of opportunity, specifically in New York. And, you know, my grandparents lived very happy lives. And my grandmother even insisted on being buried here because this was her home. And I think it's giving them a lot of opportunities, but it's also just really sad to think about them having to up and leave their families and their towns. And I feel like as I'm older, when I go to Puerto Rico, because I didn't go for the first time until I was 18, which is really sad. But I was able to see the house that my great-great-grandmother lived in, and there's just so much history there. And I do think that regardless of where you're coming from, I think any sort of immigration or migration to a different country or a different land is pretty stressful, and it can be taxing on the kids, especially like you said for your brother. So I think it's just all a learning experience, but I'm glad that it all works out, you know, like they got their jobs, they got their families, and yeah, I think it's okay.
Yeah, I feel like society has deemed America as like a land of opportunity. And the article that I had read that I'll mention later, it had mentioned that moving upwards in life can lead to both obstacles and opportunity. And I kind of resonate with that because I was born in New York. I was born in the U.S. My parents, they were born, both of them, in Dominican Republic. My dad had moved here and then married my mom and then moved her over here. And from what they tell me, there was a lot of moving around. And my dad, how Yael was saying that it's more like you lose a little professionalism when you look for a job here. Because I feel like my dad could be considered more professional in Dominican Republic, but here he had to do more hands-on job. So my dad's a jeweler, and then my mom, she cleans houses. So it's just like, that's how they make ends meet. I wish there was a better opportunity for them because I'm sure this wasn't their dream. It's just something they had to do to make ends meet and to progress in life. And it makes me grateful as their daughter because I'm the second generation and I have better opportunities than they had growing up. So it's like, that's something to keep in mind. I just feel like the entire situation just makes you look at things differently. So,
yeah, that's awesome. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that.
So like I was saying before, like the beginning is especially hard, but it does get better. It gets better by becoming more adjusted to your surroundings, finding a good social circle. So like friends to surround yourself with by slowly but surely acquiring capital and wealth. The last point is especially important because in Ramona Hernandez and Silvio Torres' book, Latinos in New York, they mention how Dominicans have carved out an important sector of the economy in New York. Dominicans run a lot of significant portion of bodegas and gypsy cabs. We also own 2 local television programs and 3 supermarket chains. The Dominican middle class has also expanded. More and more Dominican youth have earned bachelor's degrees and then gone on to earn higher wages, and so they've entered the middle class. So basically, the Dominicans in New York play a substantial role in the economy. And now, while that sounds great, on the other hand, Hernandez and Torres acknowledge that around 1/3 of Dominicans live below the poverty line in New York. So while Dominicans come here to escape poverty, many of them are still subjected to it. But the U.S. does offer more ways out of poverty than DR does. And it's also important to keep in mind that the U.S., the poverty experience in the U.S. is different than the poverty experience in DR. The poverty in DR is more severe. And in the U.S., there's more welfare, like food stamps and rental assistance, that can help poor people, get by. But in DR, it's not as prevalent, the welfare system. So I say all of that to say that immigrating in the U.S., while initially might be gruesome, in the long run, it can be beneficial because the standard of living in the U.S. is better and there are more opportunities to make it big. So Renato is not misguided. He's right in wanting to come to the US. And now I will pass it on to Daniela, who will speak more about the social mobility among Dominicans.
So firstly, let's talk about social mobility and what it means. Social mobility is the ability for a person or a family to move up in a social and or economic status. So Dominicans face significant income inequality, so it only makes sense that they try to climb their way up to financial stability. In this movie, we can see that the main character, Renato, is hoping to find a wealthy woman in order to improve his life. It's a comedic take on real social issues, and it highlights the struggles and opportunities that come with social mobility. So many Dominicans migrate to the U.S. in search for better opportunities. This allows upward mobility for future generations to come, being that they are presented with the opportunity the first generation wasn't presented with, like education or job opportunities. The article Latinos in New York discusses the struggles and successes of Dominican immigrants in New York. It shows us how they were able to better their lives overall despite certain struggles such as discrimination. I wanted to discuss the stats of this. So on page 23, we're provided with a table of the Latino population in New York City between 1990 and 2010. Between the first 2 decades, it had been a little over 18% increase in population, continuing with a 25.8% increase by 2010. For a more specific viewpoint, 1990 had a population of 332,713 Dominicans, and by 2010, there had been 576,701 Dominicans in New York. And moving on to gender roles and how they correlate, gender roles are expectations for men and women that society deems fit. So the second article that I had cited is called Racial and Ethnic Variations in Gender-Related Attitudes, and it examines how different racial and ethnic groups in the U.S. view gender roles and inequality. So in the third page of the article, it states how Hispanic women are more likely than African-American women to be economically dependent on men. So I feel like this increases the pressure on men to fulfill traditional provider roles. It reinforces the expectations that society had put on men to be the primary providers in the family, and it creates this stress if they struggle to make ends meet. I feel like it's prevalent in the movie because Renato is trying to move up in his social mobility ladder, and he doesn't seem that stressed. I feel like because it's comedic, you don't feel that sense of urgency that he has. But it's obvious that, you're trying to get wealth, and with wealth, you're able to do and provide for more people. So I feel like that's the correlation between the two. So me being Dominican, as I mentioned before, I have witnessed firsthand the journey it has taken my parents to climb up this social mobility ladder and the pressure that it has given the first generation. But overall, there are obstacles and opportunities when it comes to social mobility. But how do these relate to toxic masculinity?
So before I get into toxic masculinity, I just want to say I agree with both of your guys' viewpoints, even though my family didn't experience it firsthand. One other aspect I found sad and quite frustrating is that Renato feels that he is not smart enough due to his not knowing English. In the first 30 minutes or so of the movie, he describes why he likes people from America, and he literally says that they're so smart for knowing English since they were young. But why does he feel inferior to Americans for not knowing English? Even without saying it, you can tell he feels kind of less than, and that makes me sad because I personally feel the opposite. I grew up understanding Spanish and hearing it, but I don't speak it fluently. And I always felt like I would feel so much smarter if I did know it. And of course, I'm saying knowing it on top of English, but I personally appreciate and love the beauty of appreciating your culture and staying true to it. I think there's always room for growth, and I love learning about different cultures, but it makes me sad that he feels like he has to learn English and he has to be with a white woman. There's a whole generation of Latinos who were forced to hide their accents and only speak English to seem smarter. And this example just highlights how American standards affect people all around the world in negative ways. But in terms of toxic masculinity, I do think that was the most prevalent theme in the movie and in some of the things we've talked about during class. So this whole idea of machismo is super prominent in the movie. The fact that Renato felt the need to win over a woman to live a successful life shows how society prioritizes this idea of being a desirable man. He also continued to gloat to his friends about how he found a beautiful white woman when he kind of tricked them by bringing them all over. And then he ended up degrading Black and Latino women in that process. So he was glorifying the features of a white woman and gloating about it. But like I mentioned earlier, like, what about his mom? You know, like, would he have that conversation in front of his mom, in front of his cousins? But it's so natural to talk about women in that aspect. And I think it's not a positive thing. I think it's important to note why men all over the world, but specifically in Dominican Republic, feel this way. I was reading an article by the Pittsburgh Courier, and the article explains how colonial history in Cuba created similar systems of racial and gender inequality. Often related to ideas about how men should act, the quote that stood out to me was, "Cuba is still a culture that values whiteness, and race still matters, not only aesthetically, but for opportunity as well. Non-white Cubans are underrepresented in a university level, in managerial and other top positions, in the media and in the government." So in Sanky Panky, you see a similar idea through Gennaro's over-the-top masculine behavior, where he feels pressured to use charm and romance to quote-unquote make it out. He feels that he needs a white woman to fulfill his dreams, but these ideas don't just come out of nowhere. Of course, they come from the constant racism. But the men like Gennaro, who continue to entertain this idea that white women are their only way out, make it harder for young men to accept who they are and who their families are. So in an example like this, I think about my little brother. He's Puerto Rican, and I don't want him to ever be told that the way he is, the way his family is not good enough, and that his emotions and his want for a genuine connection with someone is not valid, that it has to be purely sexual, purely physical. So a scene that stood out to me in the movie was when Gennaro and his friends were talking about women in a very sexual way, like I mentioned before. I feel like in the movie, it was meant to be comedic, like me and Daniela were saying, but in many ways, it just shows how comfortable men are talking about women like that. And as a woman, I just don't appreciate it. So I'm sure everyone in Gennaro's friend group don't see a woman as purely an object. They probably grew up feeling emotional connections towards people and genuinely trying to make connections, but they were told that you have to keep this certain like persona, and it's fun or acceptable from your peers to talk that way. So there's another article that I was reading in Variety, which is a magazine. There was a man named Carlos Fernandez who spoke on his upbringing. He says, "La clase de tigueraje aimed to shape teenagers into strong, homophobic, aggressive men, devoid of emotions and other patterns of toxic masculinity that are now being questioned by new generations." He says, hopefully this film that he was in invites that reflection. So they pointed out that the camps run today have changed and given a shift from such ideas, but unfortunately the country and society still expects us to be men. But the men is in quotations because they have their own idea of what a man should be. I think overall, toxic masculinity is an issue in our world, and it's sad that men are raised to think that their feelings and emotions and genuine connections with people are not valid unless they are seen a certain way. But I do appreciate that in Sanky Panky, Gennaro kind of matures in the idea that he is worthy of having a genuine connection outside of the physical aspect of it. And I know we talked about how his friends ended up leaving the country, and I think his name was Celo, the one who with the ponytail. He was just sleeping with women left and right, and I don't think he's necessarily a bad person for it, but I think being so public with that sort of mindset and persona is due to society telling them that that's what you have to do to be quote unquote a man.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Like as a Dominican man myself, like you do hear that in the Dominican community that your worth as a man is kind of related to how many women you are involved with. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, I can relate to it. But yeah.
I think overall the movie was really funny, and I think, like Daniela said, it's a really good way to shed light on real life problems while also keeping it comedic.
Yeah, I feel like people are more likely to listen to something serious if you catch their attention. And usually people do that with a source of entertainment. That's why there's a lot of like satirical pieces out there, not just this one, because society hates to hear about themselves. So in a way that it makes them laugh, it also makes them think. And I feel like this movie did a good job showing that.
I think that's a great place to end off. Thank you for listening to us. And hopefully if you ever have the chance, especially during winter break, you can watch the movie. It is really funny and,
And they have subtitles.
Yeah. Yes. So
Yes.
thank you. And I see you guys in class.
Thank you guys for your opinions on the movie and the different prominent themes throughout. It was super insightful and amazing to see the connections that can be made with our day-to-day lives, as well as other literary works. And I'm sure plenty of our audience members are now interested in watching the movie. So our second group's focus is going to be on a work of literature following the same themes that our first group spoke about. So let's turn it over to Mercy and Julia to hear what they have to say.
Hi, I'm Mercy.
Hi, I'm Julia, and today we'll be talking about Hungry Ghosts, the novel by Kevin Jared Hussein.
Some of the things we'll be talking about are toxic masculinity, escapism, and marriages/interpersonal relationships under patriarchy. We're going to contextualize perceptions of masculinity, specifically in the Caribbean first. And what I found a quote from Patricia Anderson's article, Measuring Masculinity in an Afro-Caribbean Context. And in her research, she found that it said, the machismo attitudes included the belief that boys should have sex to demonstrate their manhood and that there are benefits from having early sex. The risk-taking behaviors included multiple sexual partnerships and inconsistent condom use. I think Hans is the perfect example of that mindset because he treats women as objects for their own satisfaction and not as people with their own needs or feelings. Like for him, it's all about power, and he thinks that being with multiple women makes him more of a man.
There's many ways that you can read into Hans's infidelity, for sure.
I think like one of them is like Hans views Marley not as like a partner, but as someone who he can dominate and like control. His infidelity and lack of respect for autonomy reflect the machismo mindset that she's describing in the article, and it kind of emphasizes like his belief in his like entitlement to fulfill his own desires, and he doesn't really care about the harm that it causes Marley. And also I wanted to talk about him and Shweta and how he exploits her. He uses his position of power to manipulate her and treating her as of an object of like lust rather than a person, and it kind of illustrates his view of women as tools for his satisfaction.
Yes, that's really interesting that you see it that way. Part of me may be hopelessly optimistic. I somewhat believe that Hans could have loved Shweta, even though he exploited her for sure. I totally agree with you on that. In the end, though, his love for himself triumphs over the love that he had for his family. And Shweta's words to him during their argument, she says, "You ain't never know what you want, Hans. You always look all over the place looking for it," which I find resonates really truthfully with his character. I think he has some deep insecurities that make him use women like Shweta and Marley to build himself up.
I agree with that. I also wanted to talk about his toxic attitudes towards Krishna. Hans shows very little connection to Krishna, and he kind of prioritizes like what he wants over them being a nurturing father. And the lack of care, like it perpetuates like the cycle of toxic masculinity. And as Krishna grew up in an environment where emotional suppression like is prominent, I feel like it might follow him to the future because that's all he knows. That's what he sees in his life.
That reminds me of the book by Jen Waldron, In the Country of Men. So I'm going to read this quote from it, that it is a vow against all odds, in the face of countless examples to the contrary, that it does not have the utilitarian effect of mom or ma. It's still spoken as a ballad refrain. It's a pledge that originates in the heart and fights for life amid the carnage of persistent, obvious history, to the contrary, an excruciating scant follow-through. Mother love is a plenty and apparent. We complain because we have really looks up to his father as his ultimate role model. And in fact, when Hans was beginning to spend more time away when he got the job from Marley, Krishna actually indicts Shweta for her failure as a wife. He tells her, "You ain't good to Pa. That's why he ain't want to be here." And it makes me wonder if Krishna hadn't been killed, whether or not he would have grown up to be like Hans, because we see that he's beginning to internalize a lot of the patriarchal values. And right before he was killed, he had imagined his life in the Shangor house. Life could have been like the photographs in the magazines. Life could finally be lived, he thought. And the next thing that we wanted to talk about was Hans and Marley's relationship with poverty. So I wanted to start this off with a quote from an article by Neil Sempath called Crabs in a Bucket. She says, members of each gender nominally involve reputation as their stratagem. For men, this usually takes the form of overt sexual banter and bravado. Women delve deeply into the nuances of party-going and local concepts of fashion. In line with this, both men and women, but especially men, superficially tout the idea that it is a free society, free for the individual to do as he or she pleases. A strong reputation which emphasizes personal freedom is deemed important in the post-slavery, post-plantation, and post-colonial environment. So, just to provide some background context, Hans comes from a line of indentured Indian laborers who were brought over to Trinidad and Tobago in 1845 by the British. So he is a Hindu, which the state historically considered a second-class citizen, while Marley, she also grew up in poverty and worked in a brothel for her childhood.
It's interesting to see how they both play into flaunting their reputation. Like, for example, Marley married into Changor's wealth and adopted the image of a perfect and feminine wife. It reminded me of Lada, the little girl from the barracks who Krishna had a crush on. At her young age, she already accepted the fact that she has to marry rich. So it kind of shows how deep-rooted this stratum is.
This reminds me of Bell Hooks and her book, The Will to Change, which examines masculinity in patriarchal systems. And I just found the whole book to resonate really truthfully with Hungry Ghosts. And one of the quotes that stood out to me the most was, "There is only one emotion that patriarchy values when expressed by men. That emotion is anger. Real men get mad. Their madness, no matter how violent or violating, is deemed natural, a positive expression of patriarchal masculinity. Anger is the best hiding place for anybody seeking to conceal pain or anguish of spirit." I found this to be really interesting in that, anger is only, an emotion that exists on the surface, but it exists on the surface, but it also has a lot of deep-rooted causes, and one of those primary causes is pain. And just relating this to Hans, especially in the end of the novel, when he finally admits what I think he's been holding on to for a long time, he tells his wife, "If I was any other kind of man, I would have knocked you down already." And of course, he hits her hard enough that she falls to the ground. What was your reaction to that scene?
To me, the scene was very shocking and heartbreaking because it showed how much Hans had been damaged by the same system that made him believe anger and violence were his only outlets. Like, it wasn't just about his anger. It was more about how he was never taught how to deal with his pain or show vulnerability in healthier ways. For Hans, his anger isn't just about what's happening in that moment. It's years of frustration, insecurity, and unspoken pain finally boiling over. When he was like, "If I was any other kind of man, I would have knocked you down already." It's a chilling line because it's like he's trying to justify what he's about to do, as if his violence is expected or natural because of how he's been taught to be as a man. And when he actually hits her, it's the ultimate expression of all the emotions he's been holding in, but in the most harmful way possible.
Distinct things were going through my mind. I especially wanted to note that after his bout of violence, Hans, when he finally came into himself, he regained some of his conscientious thought. It was sad that he felt himself reduced to the stance of a little boy about to receive blows from his father. Those were the lines from the book.
I recently saw this play by Dominique Mariceau called Bad Creole, and it's about a young woman who goes back to Haiti to stay with her cousin after their grandmother passes away. But there was one character that really stood out to me, and his name was Pita. Pita's struggle is such a powerful look at escapism. While the main character, Simone, is physically escaping to Haiti to be more in touch with her culture, Pita is dealing with his own kind of escape, hiding the parts of himself because he's scared of rejection or being harmed.
That really reminds me of Hans, like how he hid his resentment for Shweta, possibly Krishna as well, pretending to be a good husband, while simultaneously being dissatisfied with his wife and, of course, harboring resentment ultimately for himself. And during their fight, all those hidden parts of himself really came rushing out. Can you expand more on Pita's escapism in Bad Creole?
In Bad Creole, Pita is a somewhat openly gay man. And what I mean by somewhat is that everyone knows Pita's gay and he doesn't hide it. He's flamboyant, he's sassy, he carries himself with the confidence that makes his identity clear to those around him. But underneath that bold exterior, there's a deeper struggle. Though people might know Pita's gay, there's like this unspoken rule that they shouldn't necessarily say that they are. It's shared that gay people are often beaten or killed because of who they are, and Pita does end up getting beaten for meeting up with other queer folk like him. And he tells Simone that he felt free with other people like him. Though things ended rough that night, he felt like his true self, and he loves his home, but I guess in a sense, he wishes he could escape the violence and oppression that people like him deal with.
I'm always interested in how queer men actually proceed in the patriarchy. That sounds like a really interesting play. Because in the patriarchy, there's always this heightened awareness around other men's perceptions of you. Even among straight men, it's so much just trying to assimilate to the expectations of other men. But that itself needs to be kind of suppressed or hidden. Everything that you do, it's supposed to seem as natural as possible when a lot of it is actually unnatural because you're constantly consulting with other men as to how you're supposed to act. And I was reading Kevin Jared Hosang's interview that he did with The Guardian magazine, and he spoke about the inspiration behind the book name, which I found very enlightening. He said, it originated in ancient Hindu tradition, where if you commit certain sins, when you die, you transform into a being where your mouth is very small and your appetite is extremely large. So you would have this unending anger and hunger and no way to satiate it. I thought it was a good analogy to explain the character motivations in the book, especially where social mobility is concerned, and whatever life you attain, it can never be enough. So upon hearing this, I'm curious, how do you see that in the society we're living in today? Because it's definitely not exclusive to only 1940s Trinidad.
Well, I've seen in my own personal life, toxic masculinity is very prominent, especially in the Latino community. Growing up, I saw a lot of men in my family kind of have this bold exterior because, they were the men and they had to take care of the women or the children. And I noticed the boys of the family are raised to believe that they have to be these protectors and providers. And their worth is kind of measured by how much control they can assert, whether in their relationships, families, or societies. Another example is outside of the Latin community. In modern capitalist societies, there's this constant pressure to achieve more, whether it's buying a bigger house, getting a better job, or having the latest technology. And just like in the book, no matter how much people attain or receive, it doesn't feel enough, and there's always another goalpost or another level to reach.
Definitely. I mean, in late stage capitalism, the society that we're living now, we see how this affects both men and women. And I think this contributes largely to how isolated we have become, and obviously our loneliness epidemic, in that all we want to do is achieve more and attain more materialistic wealth. But at the same time, there's so much depression, there's so much anxiety, and yeah, definitely it's one of the failures that we have in our economic system is not actually being able to be happy truly.
That includes our segments discussion. We hope you had a good time. Thank you for listening. And
Goodbye.
yeah, bye.
Thank you, Mercy and Julia, for your analysis on Hungry Ghost and the toxic masculinity that's woven throughout the story. Your insight was wonderful to hear about. I want to thank our speakers for their analysis and their experiences said in this podcast. I would also like to thank our audience members for listening in. And if anyone is interested in similar content, our fellow classmates have also made podcasts this semester, so feel free to check them out. Thank you so much for listening.